We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's.
Did the CIA write Wind of Change by the Scorpions?
As humans busied themselves about the various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied.
Dr. Loeb, what percentage chance do you give it that you have indeed uncovered extraterrestrial or non-human technology?
With infinite complacence, people went about their affairs, yet across an immense ethereal gulf, intellects vast and unsympathetic threw their plans against us.
Prior to your abduction, did you believe in UFOs or any sort of alien life form?
All Things Unexplained.
So some of that, I think, sir, we'll save for closed session.
Hello, all you unexplained ones out there. It's me, CJ Derringer. I am here with my co-hosts, Dr. Mounts and Smitty Neems, and we have an epic show for you. We have got the legend himself, Matt Pruitt, here to talk to us about the legend Sasquatch, the author of the Phenomenal Sasquatch. Just in chatting with him before this show, I can tell that you know so much about this creature that we are all so fascinated with. So let's dive right into it, Matt. How did you get interested in Sasquatch?
Well, I've told the story many times, so I'll make it brief. I won't belabor it. But like many people who do investigate the phenomenon, I had an experience when I was young. It was when I was 17, and that was in the mountains of Northeast Georgia where I grew up. But it was an audio-only experience. We didn't have a visual sighting. It was myself and 4 friends, and experienced what many people would associate with the Sasquatch phenomenon, and sort of these intimidating loud sounds from branch breaking and a tree being pushed over, or the sound of a tree cracking and falling, and these loud percussive sounds and vocalizations. And so, but because we didn't see the things, we couldn't really reconcile it. It didn't seem that they were human interlopers that we were dealing with, and they certainly didn't behave like any normal animals. And so that was in 1999, way back in the 1900s. And then I later stumbled across Sasquatch information online a couple of years later, and honestly thought the proposition was fairly ridiculous, that there could be, an undescribed species of hominoid in North America. And to make a long story short, as I started reading eyewitness testimonies and learning about people who had claims related to experiences that were very similar to what we experienced, that was pretty eye-opening. And then to hear purported vocalization recordings that were nearly identical to what we heard was very compelling. And so that's really what began the question in my mind of trying to figure out, like, well, could that have been? Would that be actually the simplest explanation for what we encountered? And started looking into historical reports and interviewing other local witnesses. And that was all in about 2002. And I thought, I will get to the bottom of this pretty quickly. And here we are 21 years later, and I'm still trying to get to the bottom of it. And I'm still trying to figure out, if that's the most reasonable explanation or not.
The people that were with you that day, did they also dive into this thirst for knowledge about Sasquatch, or did they kind of leave it alone?
Yeah, they really left it alone. I mean, it's an interesting thing to see how people respond to things of that nature. And I've seen this multiple times in my life now, where people with a certain sort of like interpretive schema or worldview will more easily accept an explanation that it was just like ethereal or metaphysical or paranormal in nature, because they still can't reconcile. Well, we know those weren't people that we encountered in the dark, because it was at night in a very dense, southern Appalachian forest. And they know that it wasn't, bears or deer or some other normal conventional animal. But so some of them thought, oh no, that place had a reputation for being haunted, and that's just what we experienced. It was just some sort of, haunting behavior, elementals. I've heard all sorts of terms being thrown out. And I mean, I've experienced it later in life with other friends in the field who were not investigating the Sasquatch phenomenon, but who were interested in seeing the way that myself and others investigated it, had a very interesting experience / encounter, I guess you could say, on the east side of the Cascades in Washington State back in 2010. And there were 6 of us, myself and my field research partner, and these 4 essentially skeptics, urbanite skeptics, all four of them saw two upright figures emerge from this forest, walk sort of in our direction. And then once they could see us, they turned and went back into this forest. And myself and my field research buddy were looking the wrong direction and we missed it. And then we had rocks thrown. It was a wild event, but even in retrospect, they were like, no, it can't be, because there's no such thing. It just could not have been a Sasquatch. And so two of those people came to visit me here in Tennessee, where I live, a few years ago. And I told my wife this story so many times, because it happened before we met, that when these friends came to visit, it was another couple. I said, hey, tell my wife what happened that night, because she's heard my version of it. And so the two of them told the story exactly the way I tell it. And my wife was like, okay, what do you think that was? And they were like, after all these years, we think it had to be ghosts, because there's no such thing as a Sasquatch. And so, and again, they knew it wasn't people, and they knew it wasn't some, conventional, again, some mundane animal that you'd encounter in the Pacific Northwest. So they rationalized that as, and these are fairly materialistic, not spiritually leaning or supernaturally oriented people. But it's funny, because the proposition that there could be this species of hominoid, of ape in North America, that probably, if they do exist, probably came here from Asia, where there is a fossil record of very large apes. That's a very simple explanation. It doesn't require any additions to known science. But for some reason, that proposition is very difficult for people to contend with. And so I just on a whim, I was like, okay, well, you think they're ghosts. Like, what do you think a ghost is? Just curious, and immediately rattled off this laundry list, which is really a list of assumptions or speculation. Oh, well, a ghost is, a person who's died and they're trapped between worlds and they don't know they're dead, but, they can't carry on to the next world and they carry on in this world. And it's like, well, wait a minute. You think that's more likely animal that fits the description of Sasquatch reports? So it's a long-winded answer to your question, I suppose. But no, the other people, they've been supportive, and some of them I'm still in touch with, because they're people I grew up with from that first encounter. But they were not, especially in those early years, were like, oh, there's no way that such thing as Sasquatch exists. So it had to be ghosts.
Maybe those friends were just trying to rally you up when they answered your wife.
That's what they interpreted. And even though, when I lived in the Northwest, I lived out there for 3 years and spent a lot of time with these people. And, so they'd heard a lot about, my research and the research of others and this, collection of work, but still just would not go there. So for some reason, of all the propositions that occur, I'd say the big three being unknown, mystery apes, UFOs, and apparitions. For some reason, the idea that apes are around in North America is the most controversial and stigmatized one. People have the hardest time with it, which to me is preposterous, because it's the simplest one. It's the most likely of all those phenomena. I mean, I guess to clarify that, people clearly are having these experiences. So there is some phenomena that they're encountering, whether it's entirely psychological or entirely physical, like an empirical referent, or whether it's some combination of both. But the fact of the matter is, it's these interpretations. Well, what's behind unidentified objects in the sky? Well, you get a lot of interpretations. Non-human intelligence, extraterrestrial beings, breakaway civilization, advanced technology, our technology, adversarial technology, etc. What's behind apparitions? And people will say, oh, the consciousness surviving past death, or the projection of a living conscious agent, or the playback of the environment that's recorded past events, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what's behind the Sasquatch phenomenon? Well, that's easy. There's other animals that sort of fit this description. The other apes, or close, human ancestors, let's say, are still an option on the table. And there are these apes in the fossil record that are a lot like what people describe as the Sasquatch. And that doesn't require, if you think about those other two, a lot of the interpretations around UFOs, around apparitions, require a whole host of new sciences, or at least new discoveries within relevant disciplines, for those interpretations to be sufficient. And yet people will grab those like it's a matter of fact without questioning it. And then if I offer up, well, hey, there might be one extra mammal in North America, people are like, hogwash, filth, blasphemy. It's ridiculous. So I've encountered that many times.
Oh, I bet you have. There's certainly we were talking about this before we went on air, a stigma, right, attached to these creatures. Now, we were briefly talking about it before we started, but you say Sasquatch. That's the term that you used for your book that you write versus Bigfoot. A lot of people know it as Bigfoot. Tell us all why you choose Sasquatch instead of the term Bigfoot.
Well, I mean, they all have cultural baggage and they all carry some degree of like stigma. Bigfoot is so goofy sounding to me, and it always has been. And that's sort of the media's go-to word. And it is sort of dismissive. I mean, I've made this joke a few times, but it's funny to see, when the Yeti sort of emerged in the early 20th century out of Asia and started to get discussed in, the Western world, let's say, there was essentially a typo that accidentally changed one of the letters in the Himalayan word. And so the rough translation of the typo was filthy snowman. And so the press changed that to abominable snowman, which sounds a little like erudite and a little, haughty. Abominable snowman. It's sort of like this, not quite scholarly, but it's just funny that in the States, they found large tracks and, oh, it's Bigfoot, so it has this sort of goofy ring to it. Whereas, the word Bigfoot was coined essentially or was associated with this phenomenon in 1958. And, with a series of tracks that were found and cast in the Bluff Creek region, Northern California. But there was an English teacher on the Chehalis Reservation in southern British Columbia, J.W. Burns, who wrote a number of articles for a magazine called Maclean's. And he wrote some of the early articles about indigenous and other, non-native local stories related to these, mystery apes in southern British Columbia. And so he anglicized a Halcomelum word for the ease of pronunciation and for the ease of print to call it Sasquatch. And that was in 1929. So that's the older of the terms, but it sort of carries the weight of the indigenous and First Nations cultures and the melding of that with non-native cultures. So I feel like, and it's just frankly a cooler sounding word than Bigfoot. So to me, that's the term that I always try to lean on, because most people hear Bigfoot and they transmute that in their minds to the cultural representations that they've seen associated with that word, which are, the monstrous murring creatures of bad B horror movies, or the comical like troglodyte caveman of schlocky sort of things. And so that's when people think, oh, you look for Bigfoot, they don't picture, some elegantly adapted hominoid. They picture the thing from those B movies. You're looking for that. And so it helps divorce that idea a little bit, to use the word Sasquatch. At least I hope so.
Well, I can certainly appreciate that.
Oh, yeah.
If you are joining us live and you have questions for Matt, please do type them in the chat. Put them in all caps so that we know that it is a question. We do take time at the end of each show to pull some of those listener questions in, and we all greatly appreciate them. So send us your questions. All right, Tim, I'm going to throw it to you here.
Well, first of all, Matt, I had to say, it sounds like to me your friends that were more willing to call your encounter and put it off on ghost. That's a perfect example, right, of why it's better. The term Sasquatch is better than Bigfoot, because Bigfoot really does carry so much stigma and negative connotation with it.
Well, I think even back then, our view of it would have been, because I don't remember thinking about Bigfoot very much in those days, obviously, but it probably, because the way that the media are always portrayed it, for most people, they think of it as a singular figure, like a character, like Frankenstein or Dracula or Zeus or something. And so a lot of people, and I've encountered this many times over the last 2 decades, when they hear about Bigfoot sightings, it's like, he was seen again in the mountains, and then he made his way down to Texas and was seen there, and then he went over to Georgia and was seen there, as if there's just this one immortal creature just wandering around North America. And so that's an easily dismissible idea. And I still, it's not as much now, but many times people would be like, oh, so, he's in Georgia and he gets around to Oregon. And it's like, No one thinks that. No serious contender thinks for a second that there's just one,
Yeah.
but that's probably like the
I
normative
think
way of thinking
it
at
was
that time.
one when we were when we first started this show. It was actually a question I asked. I'm like, is there just one
Guilty.
Bigfoot or like lots
Well,
of
that's the
big
way it's been
out there?
presented for so long. That's the way
Yeah.
the media has presented it. They use those singular terms, he, him, as instead of like referring to it as a species, or this sighting represented one individual of a species or something like that. So I'm not blaming the public, let's say, for having that impression. So again, in the same way that people would hear that you're searching for Sasquatch and they think that you're looking for this, campfire creature, campfire story monster, some B horror movie monster, or they think you're searching for this singular individual, that's not really their fault. It's because what they're hearing, let's say, what they're transmuting is this cultural representation that's been given by the media and, bad movies and schlocky films and things like that.
Oh, for sure. And is it any wonder, right, with things like The Legend of Boggy Creek, which is still a great movie and set in rural Arkansas, or when you had the big, Bigfoot battling the $6 million man, on television, and it was clearly just a really tall, big dude dressed up like a Bigfoot, and you had things like Planet of the Apes coming out. It's really no wonder that it got associated with such a hokey character, is it?
Oh,
Harry and the
it's no
Hendersons.
surprise at all.
Harry and the Hendersons, yeah. Yeah. And it makes you wonder, did the media really take off on it because it was popular? And I guess it did become popular, or do you think that there could have been some sort of disinformation campaign going on here? Like maybe this is a real thing and somebody is behind possibly steering public perception away from the possibility of a biological reality?
No, I really don't. In all the years of doing this and networking with so many people, interviewing so many hundreds and hundreds of witnesses, and many of whom held government jobs, whether that's state government, federal governments, and in all sorts of, whether it's, Department of Agriculture over the U.S. Forest Service, or Department of the Interior over the Park Service, or BLM, or something of that nature. I've never seen anything that would lead me to believe that there is an institutional cover-up by the government. Now, what I've seen is that there is a suppression, and the suppression always happens at the level of the individual, because it was already stigmatized, prior to these things. And so people that have encounters or have sightings, or at least that claim to have encounters or claim to have sightings, or that find or document tracks, are very, they're disincentivized to talk about such things in their professional capacity or in a professional setting. And so most people just don't tell anyone. A small number of those people will tell a loved one, a close family member, a spouse, a friend, someone of that nature. And a very small subset of those will tell a complete stranger, like a Sasquatch researcher or investigator or something of that nature. And so one of the questions that I've always asked people, and at this point, I've interviewed over 2,000 witnesses since 2002. A lot of that was, during the period of time when I was with the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, especially once Finding Bigfoot became popular, then a lot of reports were coming in. Well, let's say I've interviewed that many claimants, claim to have witnessed such things. But one question I would always ask is like, well, did you ever feel like reporting this to an authority, law enforcement, game warden, something of that nature? And the answer was 99.9% of the time, no. And like, oh, did you ever feel like reporting this to local media? And it was absolutely not. And I've seen the same with people in these government roles, whether they are encounters on military installations, which do happen, like Fort Bragg in North Carolina, Fort Lewis in Washington, some of these other places. They just don't report it to anyone. First of all, it's not what they're there to do. They're not there to discover new species. That's sort of outside of their purview. And they know they're not going to be believed. And they're very often in positions where to make a claim that's unbelievable might open you up to a whole lot of trouble, certain sorts of like evaluations or things of that nature. And so that's just not reported. So the suppression seems to always happen at the individual level.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're seeing that play out in real time right now with some of these military government whistleblowers and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, their entire life becomes fodder for the media, and they can take the smallest thing and really try to twist it against you. So, and we actually talked to Patricia Cornwell this afternoon about her upcoming book called Unnatural Death. And basically, there's a Bigfoot involved, right? And one of the characters is really into the Bigfoot phenomenon, but that opens him up to, being questioned on a professional level. So it's certainly a real thing. And one of the reasons we're here tonight is because, Matt, you have written a fantastic new book called The Phenomenal Sasquatch. And folks, you can buy The Phenomenal Sasquatch right now. If you head over to BigfootUFO.com, there's a link right at the top there. You can purchase Matt's incredible book, The Phenomenal Sasquatch. I've read it. I would call it nothing short of groundbreaking in its contribution to the scientific field of knowledge of Sasquatch. And I have to know, and our listeners want to know, what was your inspiration for writing The Phenomenal Sasquatch?
Well, thank you so much for the kind words. Very, very generous of you. Having pursued it for this long, both, heavily in the field, and I still continue to pursue field research very heavily to this day, but also sort of in the armchair. I think a good researcher should be equal parts armchair and field research, the sort of like conceptual analysis as well as like practical field work. I heard it described as like from the propositional to the participatory, like a good blend of those two. And so over the years of just speaking with so many people about the subject, I started doing media interviews about the Sasquatch phenomenon in 2007. So I've been speaking publicly about it for a long time, and just have the good fortune of interacting with people who said, "Hey, you should write a book because there's some things that you have to offer that I think people should know about," which was very generous. We'll see if that's true or not. But the other big motivation was, very often I'm always asked, like, what books would you recommend? And as you can see, like, there's no shortage of books on the Sasquatch. Like, this shelf here is that's all strictly Sasquatch or mystery ape related books. And so of course I have the top 5 that I consider to be required reading. And then, that stressed out to the top 10 that would be like suggested or like, heavily suggested reading, and stressed out to the top 15 or 20. And so the other aim I had was like, well, I would love to write the kind of book that I wish was available for me when I first started looking into the subject, and that I wish was available for me now, 20 years into it. So it wouldn't just be a cursory overview or an introduction, but it would also be very relevant to people, even if they're already devoted students of the subject. So that what I was aiming for, and we'll see if I hit it or not, but the feedback has been very kind, thankfully. But I wanted it to be the sort of book that if someone only ever read one book about the subject, they could read this one and have a very thorough education on the entirety of the phenomenon thus far, and sort of like synthesize a lot of the greatest things that have been written so far in my estimation, and then expand and develop that beyond what had already been written or said or explored through my own, essentially, the lens that I see it through, to get people to see it the way I sort of see it. So all of that kind of coalesced in that project. And it took 3 years because it's all me. I did everything myself. So it took a minute for sure.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think you've definitely accomplished something. I mean, I think it's definitive. I would call it the definitive Sasquatch book, hands down, bar
Very
none.
kind of you.
Well, and I mean it. And I tell you what, chapter 1 is a great example, because I love how you just get right after it in chapter 1, which is called The Fundamental Question. And you don't hold back. You go right into it. What is the source of the Sasquatch phenomenon? And you've mentioned a little bit about this already, and it's really multifactorial, right? Some biological and some other situations come into play. What can you tell us about what is the source of the Sasquatch phenomenon between, claimants and on down the line?
Well, I wish I knew. I'm seeking the origins. No one has a demonstrative sort of proof of like what is the source. But without what if we're staying in the realm of the known, so we're not invoking, again, sort of, I don't want to say fringe as a pejorative, but if we're not going to invoke like the extraterrestrial, the supernatural, the metaphysical, the otherworldly, it's like, okay, well, the argument that's been, the debate that's been raging for these many decades, since the birth of Bigfoot in 1958 and the dawn of field research of people sort of chasing the Sasquatch phenomenon in the field, is that, well, either there are animals fitting the description of claimants and that have feet that are shaped like the tracks that are associated with the phenomenon, or if no such animal exists, then it has to be some product of the human mind, some element of the human psyche. And in my estimation, like, spoiler alert, it could easily be both, that you could have real animals that, trigger certain responses in observers, hardwired, evolutionarily selected responses, both cognitive, psychological, and physiological, and that those sort of, the way that those get represented in narratives, in the retelling or the re-representation of such events, then they sort of take on mythic qualities and stretch into that sort of category of what people have dismissed them as like these mythological beings. But to me, if we're looking at the totality of the subject, the claims and the evidence and where they fit in relationship to each other and where they fit in time, then I do think that the simpler explanation, or the simpler of those two propositions, is that there is a biological source, that there is a species of animal, mammal, likely an ape, fitting the description of eyewitness claims, that is at the root of the Sasquatch mythos, the sort of cultural representation of these observations and encounters. But there are certainly psychological elements associated with it that are, within the human observer, that are sort of projected or, again, represented in the retellings of these experiences or these observations. And so that's to me, the fundamental question is trying to, well, how do we conclusively demonstrate that? And no one's done that yet on either side of debate. They've not been able to identify some element of the human mind or the brain or the psyche that produces such experience or such an image. There's no laboratory induced studies of hallucinations that produce phenomenologically authentic 8-foot tall hair covered apes, in lab settings, and vice versa. There's no physical remains of the Sasquatch yet. No one's collected a specimen or a diagnostic portion of a specimen. And so it's a real mystery. It's a huge conundrum. But again, what I'm trying to do with the book is to lay out everything that's sort of been discovered, let's say, thus far, always through those lenses. Like, what's more likely, that this is just the product of the human mind, or that there really is an animal species responsible for this?
In your research for the book, what is the oldest account of a Sasquatch sighting that you came across? And could you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, it really just depends. I mean, it gets really tricky the further back you go in time, because obviously there are written accounts that go back as far, once the written word was introduced in North America by non-natives, because, the indigenous peoples they passed down information orally. And so they didn't have an externalized written record of these stories. So we don't know how old a lot of those stories are, but there are these ape-like creatures that are in a number of indigenous oral traditions, and they're also represented in art. Whether there's pictographs, petroglyphs, these sort of stone carvings, totems, etc., that people interpret as being associated with the Sasquatch phenomenon. But the other tricky part of that is that, like, once non-natives came to North America and began to collect these stories, well, first of all, they dismissed a lot of it as just superstition. And then again, there's no catch-all term at that time. The Europeans really had nothing, or just the non-natives in general had nothing like the word bear, where you could encounter a number of tribes and they might describe a particular animal. Oh, that's a bear, that's a bear, that's a bear. Well, they were in the dark ages of understanding apes. I mean, gorillas weren't discovered until Paul de Chailloux in the mid 1800s, and then mountain gorillas weren't officially recognized until the early 1900s, 1902. And so for non-natives in the 1700s and early 1800s, there weren't a lot of reference, things that they could sort of compare that to. So there are references that describe animals that walk on two legs habitually, that are man-like or man-shaped, but much, much larger, that are covered in hair, that are very active at night, that tend to have very broad shoulders. They have tracks that are about 1.5 feet long that go by various terms. And so those descriptions do date back into the late 1700s and the early 1800s. And then once you have the advent of print media, I think it gets very interesting there, because when you're talking about the indigenous traditional ecological knowledge or oral traditions, they were recorded by non-natives, again, in a dismissive way, because they're describing, oh, they bear with me if I trouble you with some of their superstitions, just very hand-waving dismissals. And so they're not highly detailed. And then they are also very generalized. Whereas once you get print media, first, in the form of like circulars that would go between logging camps, mining camps, or other communities, and then newspapers. Well, now you get really specific, because you have like, John Smith on Beaver Creek at the foot of, whatever Stone Mountain saw this thing on this day of this month of this year. You get these really specific testimonies. And so those go back as long as there's been print media. And, I outline a few of those in my book, but if you can see this book there, The Historical Bigfoot, I mean, that's like 1,200 pages of print media articles describing, what we would associate with the Bigfoot or the Sasquatch. People seeing these, larger than a human man-shaped animals in forested environments in North America.
Oh yeah, and I tell you what, just all the more reason people need to get off their phones and go out in the woods and open their eyes. We're talking to Matt Pruitt, author of the Phenomenal Sasquatch, producer of the Bigfoot and Beyond podcast, Cliff and Bobo, two of our favorites as well. And CJ, I believe you have some listener comments and questions for Matt, if he's up for that.
Questions for Matt. Yes, so we'll dive right in here. We've got Simon asking, what has been the most significant encounter you have researched or had personally?
Oh, man. I'll try to answer both of those. I'll try to make it brief. I've interviewed so many witnesses that were so compelling. And I'm telling you, and you've probably experienced this if you've been, interviewing people about esoteric phenomena or esoteric subjects, things of that nature. But there is something really powerful and compelling and almost transformative about sitting face to face with someone as they describe their experience. And, especially people when you can do a lot of research and you realize like they seem to be of unimpeachable character. They hold positions of authority. They're highly esteemed in their communities. They seem to be of sound mind. They don't have anything to gain. This interview is totally off the record. They're just telling me, so that we can have a discussion. They're not trying to gain anything out of it. Those sorts of experiences with witnesses can be really powerful. And there's so many, but I mean, obviously the ones near and dear to me, there's several encounters that happened very close to where I grew up. Like one of which is it's about 1/2 mile from the house I grew up in. And that one was featured on Finding Bigfoot. I was working with the advanced production team, was a field coordinator and fixer for what became the premiere episode of that series, which we filmed in my hometown based on a lot of the reports I'd aggregated and pieces of evidence that were given to me that were used in that show. And one of the witnesses, and I know I've told this story on other podcasts recently, so forgive me if you've already heard me tell it, but it was really impactful for me, is that, I was really young at the time. And although I'm still very young now, at least I feel that way, but I was much younger back then. And so I was just bursting at the seams with excitement about the Sasquatch thing, which I still kind of am, but I've learned to, control it a bit more. But there was a witness who claimed to have seen a Sasquatch cross the road following a creek as she was coming down this hill as it crested the bank and stepped onto the road. And she slammed on her brakes and it came to a halt in the road and she skidded to a stop in front of it. So she saw it very well, fully illuminated by her headlights. This was not, obstructed by brush or vegetation or anything of that nature. And so she could see it very clearly as she described it. And they had a sort of a face-off for a few seconds, and then it continued on its way. And this being so close to the house I grew up in, I could go out my back door and walk through the woods and be at this spot in minutes. You know what I mean? And she was an upstanding person in the community, local business owner, very successful business owner. And so, I was able to make contact with her, and she was like, yeah, why don't you meet me at the spot? We'll just pull off the side of the road and I'll show you where it happened. And so she's sort of reliving it because, what's interesting too is that this happened in 1999. Her encounter was on Thanksgiving Day. And my encounter was also in 1999, but it was in the summer. And from the house I grew up in and where her encounter was, and my first encounter was only like another couple miles away. So it might have been the same individual that we heard as the same one that she saw. Who knows? But so we're standing at the spot and she's describing the experience to me. And I wasn't paying close enough attention to see that, it was really bothering her to discuss this because she'd been very frightened by the event. Whereas my brain was just like, it's like the spoof of A Beautiful Mind, where Zach Galifianakis is in the casino and all the numbers of every Sasquatch report. And they always follow the creeks and all this stuff. So I was thinking out loud when she told me the story, and I was like, I wonder what it was doing here. There's this waterway and it comes out of this area, and there's some open meadows over there. And there, because I drive through there, I'd be like, I've seen deer foraging, and maybe he's going after the deer, and just a mile a minute, 20-something-year-old me. And she said, have you ever seen one? Kind of harshly. And I said, no, I haven't. And she said, then you don't know. I thought I was going to die. And it was very serious. And I had to realize, like, okay, well, this thing that's so cool and exciting to me was not cool or exciting for her. And, I don't want to get too personal about her life, but I saw firsthand people in her life laugh in her face telling the story. And then, I had to educate them a bit about the subject and other local history, and they listened a little bit more. But and she'd already gone through a few years of that by that point. No one believed her. And so not only was this frightening experience, she was subject to she had taken her daughter food on Thanksgiving night and was driving back home, and this happened. And then no one believes her when she tries to tell people that she saw this thing. And the way she described it to me, she said, she said, it didn't do anything threatening. It just basically stood there. But she said it was so big. And she said, have you ever been driving down the road and someone swerves into your lane like they're about to hit, and you just know you're about to have head-on collision? And I was like, oh, yeah. And she said, that's exactly what this felt like experientially. It's just terror. And that has always stuck with me. And, it was a lesson I needed, and I'm glad I learned it early on, is that, again, this thing that I think is so exciting and cool is not necessarily, for most witnesses, they don't find it that exciting and cool, even in retrospect, very often. So
that sort of brings us to our next question, the idea of being made fun of and stigma. We have Eliza Harley Quinn here is asking, and this is a long one, aside from the general stigma of reporting a Bigfoot sighting, do you think that if there was an actual protocol or procedure to doing so, people would be more likely to speak up? Or would you think the stigma is still too strong and wouldn't make a difference? It's a good question.
I think it depends on a number of factors. And, I did describe some of this in the book because someone had made a suggestion a few years ago. And, I've heard variations of this suggestion many times, but someone had specifically said, oh, well, we should take a database if the witnesses are still living, like the BFRO's database, and subject witnesses who are willing to talk to psychometric evaluations and see if there's certain psychological factors that make people more likely to see a Sasquatch. And I said, well, that's not where you're going to get, because the BFRO, or even in my experience, they're getting the reports of those are people who are willing to reach out to total strangers. And so what you're going to get is not the number of people who have the experience of observing or encountering a Sasquatch. You're going to get the people who had the experience and who are willing to talk about it to a total stranger. So that's a whole nother dimension there. So let me make some predictions. Okay. You'll probably find that people are more extroverted in that category. They're probably low in neuroticism because they're less sensitive to negative emotions. So they're not as worried about being disbelieved or rejected. They're probably low in agreeableness because they don't care if you believe them or not. They want to tell someone what happened. And so I think even if we did have a protocol of sorts, you're still going to have a number of people who are just not willing to talk about it because maybe they are higher in neuroticism. And so they're just so sensitive to maybe being disbelieved. And I think people that are very high in agreeableness in terms of the big 5 personality traits are easily swayed sometimes when a skeptic's like, you don't really think you saw that, do you? That's not really what you think, is it? Oh, no, maybe it was just a bear, because they're trying to be agreeable. Or vice versa. I've seen the other thing happen where it's like, you saw a Squatch, man. There's nothing else it could have been. And it was just a silhouette in the dark 200 yards away, And they're like, yeah, I guess I did see a Sasquatch. It's like, you saw a silhouette at night, So I think to get rid of that stigma, there would have to be some assurances. But so to answer the question, I think it is possible. The other thing that I think happens that I've seen in my own experience very often is that it depends on the setting. So, for example, national parks. Well, who lives in national parks? No one. They're protected. They're national parks, right? So they're tourists. And so they're people from all over the country, and they're people from all over the world who go there. They have no personal stake in what occurs there. So they have no qualms about, hey, I saw this thing. Why? Because, well, I came here to see wildlife and I saw this weird thing. And so you have these higher reports in certain national parks, whereas, a lot of people have experiences on their own properties, but they're not willing to talk about it. They're not going to invite outsiders onto their land or into their homes, especially people that live in some of these rural areas where I grew up in Southern Appalachia. They don't want outsiders traipsing around on their property. So even then, there's a certain category of witness who's disincentivized to make such reports because it invites some element in that they might not want, whether it's outsiders, and especially, let's say, if it was some official Fish and Game or the game warden or something like that. So I do think, to the listener's question, it would be helpful, and it probably would generate more reports, but I still think there are other levels, other reasons that people have for not reporting things that hopefully we'd be able to break through at some point. But yeah, there's just so many disincentives currently. I can understand why people don't report things.
Same seems to be true in the UAP phenomena right now. Okay, we are talking with Matt Pruitt, the author of the Phenomenal Sasquatch, and you can pick up a copy of that book if you visit bigfootufo.com. We have a question from a friend of the show, Blake Best. In fact, Blake created the intro music that we used tonight. We have used his music for many things. A very talented guy. Blake, thank you for joining us.
And a cryptid author himself.
And a cryptid author, yes. So Blake is asking, Matt, how do you feel about the belief that Sasquatch are somehow connected to interdimensional travel?
I think that that's an extension of a very old idea that human beings have had about animals for as long as we've been around. And so if you dig into traditional ecological knowledge, not just related to these ape-like creatures that, we couch under the rubric of the Sasquatch now in North America, but if you look into the histories of indigenous oral traditions about a number of animals around the world, especially ones that are large, very rare, very mobile in a large home range, elusive animals, you'll find very often the same sort of beliefs associated with them, that they can mediate between worlds. Now, in pre-experimental societies, the language would usually be something like it's a mediation between the physical realm and the spiritual realm, or our world and the underworld, let's say. And I think a lot of that is just the phenomenological experience of an animal that does seem to materialize out of nothing and then vanish back into thin air, in the same way that you'd experience other elusive animals like tigers being a great example. And so the same sort of supernatural beliefs that are associated with bears, tigers, even gorillas that are associated with the Sasquatch. It's just that now that those other categories of animals are known, let's say, I mean, they've obviously been well known to indigenous peoples around the world for millennia. But, once the Western world or non-natives discovered them, now we sort of drop a lot of those more mystical lenses that we see the world through. And believe you me, we all see the world through a mystical lens to some degree. Magical thinking is sort of like the normative way of human thinking. And I've heard so many people take offense when I say that. And I'm like, look, man, science is a method. It's a process. It's very new. It's only a few hundred years old. And we had to develop it so that we could strip away the subjective to get to the objective. And people go, no. Science is the natural way of thinking. It's like, no, it's not. If it was, we wouldn't need the method. We wouldn't need the process. We would just see the world objectively, but we don't. And why? Because we're not objects. We're subjects. And so when it comes to the unknown, which currently Sasquatch is still in that category of the unknown, well, they fit that other criteria: large, rare, highly mobile, very furtive, elusive animals. But as long as they leave that sort of void in our understanding, we will populate that void with the contents of our minds, contents of our imaginations, our particular interpretive schema. And the thing is, in today's world, people like to think that they are so distant from the peoples of the past. Oh, can you believe those Stone Age people believed such hogwash? And we're the same exact creatures. We're exactly the same biological things as the humans of the past. It's just one thing we've done is update the nomenclature. So we say interdimensional rather than mediator of the physical realms and the spiritual world. But it's the same idea. It's the same core concept. It's like, well, sometimes, this animal sort of seems to appear out of nowhere and then, takes off and you can't find it again. And so how do you explain that? Okay, well, maybe it went into the spirit realm, or maybe it's interdimensional. But because I do think they're biological in nature, and I don't think that tigers or bears or gorillas have the ability to shift between dimensions or have interdimensional navigation abilities, I suspect that the Sasquatch doesn't either, but that the human experiences the Sasquatch in the same way that we do these other very rare animals.
That is a unique take on it. I actually hadn't heard of it or heard that said quite that way before. So thank you for sharing that with us. One more question from Blake, more of a personal one. So we'll see how much you know here. He said, have you heard about the Sugar Flat Road creature incident that happened in my home state of Tennessee in 1989? I don't know anything about that.
I drive through there all the time. It's near a town called Lebanon, Tennessee. It's just kind of like up the road. And there's some really pretty country out there. There's a land formation that sort of sits around Nashville. Nashville's kind of in a basin. And then there's this series of hills that's almost perfectly circular called the Highland Rim. And so there's a portion of the Highland Rim over there. And someone had made this sort of like taxidermied, I'm sure if you Googled it, you could find it, like Lebanon Bigfoot or Sugar Flat Bigfoot, but it's a taxidermied head and it's white. The fur that they use is white, almost like a white-tailed deer's tail fur or something like that. But it sat in the window of this shop in Lebanon, Tennessee, and had this whole like backstory about someone had either hit it with a car, or in other versions of the story, someone had shot it on this Sugar Flat Road, and they had cut its head off and taxidermed it. And that thing's still around somewhere. I think it's in one of those like museums of the weird now. I don't think it's here in Middle Tennessee anymore. But yes, I am familiar with that story. And surprisingly, what's really interesting, since Blake is from, I guess, that area, but at least from Tennessee, is that there were a number of reports along parts of the Highland Rim that go up until about the late 90s. And then they just totally dry up, which is interesting. Even the years that I was in the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, which had a huge database, and especially once Finding Bigfoot, which was the series about that organization, tons of reports started flooding in. None really came in from Middle Tennessee, especially from the Highland Rim. To me, that's very suggestive of a biological reality, is that, it was good habitat and it was interconnected to other portions of good habitat, like the Mississippi River Basin to the west, and then the Cumberland Plateau to the east. And then, that's part of Southern Appalachia technically. And so with progress and areas being logged and cut off and road building and then people moving into these areas, it's fascinating that the reports die off, because there were a number throughout the 20th century until the very late 90s. And so you think, well, if it was entirely imaginary, when you introduce more human observers, more hunters, more hikers, you should have more reports. If it's entirely in the mind of the observer, you wouldn't expect it to stop. And so I do think that there probably were Sasquatches, or more reports at least, being more experiences being had, or at least claimed in the Highland Rim. So, but some of that stuff is around, like, not quite Lebanon, but closer to like Carthage and some of these other areas too. Hartsville, if you're familiar with that area, Blake.
Great answer. CJ, do you have any other listener comments or questions right
No,
now?
that was it for now. So if anybody else has something they want to ask, please do put it in all caps so that I can see it, and we will see if we have time.
And those were
pull those
great. Those
Yes,
were
they
great.
were.
Again,
They
a
were.
shout out to listener Blake Best, who wrote the Squatch Rag Shine for us, and he himself is a Loch Ness expert and author. And so thanks, Blake, for those questions. And Matt, we're talking to Matt Pruitt, author of the Phenomenal Sasquatch. In chapter 5 of your book, you talk about the modern era. And this era, it seems to involve things that have infinite amounts of potential for good in the Sasquatch area, but also infinite amounts of potential for bad. And it involves all of us on here tonight. When we're talking about the Sasquatch online, we're talking about new television shows. We're talking about podcasts. You know, if you look at the Apple charts and click on science, it's filled with Bigfoot podcast. This truly is a modern era capable of good and bad. What can you tell us about this, Blake, Matt?
I think there's a lot of, I mean, again, everything has a cost and a benefit, you know. So there are certainly costs in that anonymity. Anyone can make claims. You know, previously there were only a handful of investigators. Like in the early days, there was John Green of British Columbia, who was a journalist and, you know, who interviewed witnesses and would publish these testimonies. In the early days, he would actually have witnesses sign legal affidavits, because the thought was back then that scientists would be more apt to investigate these claims if they had signed a legal affidavit, you know, testifying to the veracity of their claim. And of course, you know, that didn't quite help. And so there's a world of difference between, like, you know, interviewing a person face to face, recording their narrative, having them sign it, you know, legally testifying to its veracity, and then read it, you know, or call in to a radio show and, you know, oh, we've got John Doe on the line, and yeah, I've seen 30 of them, you know, in my barn the other day, or whatever the case may be. So of course, anonymity hurts things a bit, but it also has brought out some witnesses that are probably telling the truth. I think one of the big benefits is that it does sort of remove the gatekeeper, so to speak. I mean, because back in the day, there were sort of gatekeepers. We all have biases, right? I mean, there's things, I mean, obviously I lean towards a biological hypothesis, a biological sort of grounded view, biological, ecological view. I think they're associated with these Asian apes in history. And so that puts a number of constraints on me, obviously, because I'm like, well, how does this jive with biological reality and this, that, and the other? And so, of course, I'm going to be biased. You know, if someone's like, oh, hey, I saw one, you know, floating, levitating 40 feet off the ground and flying clear across the lake, you know, or whatever the case. No one's ever reported that to me, but those sorts of claims do exist online, you know. So there were always gatekeepers that would say, okay, I do think this report is worthy of investigation and I'll publish what I find, versus I'm not certain that this one is. Now with podcasts, people are getting to hear directly from witnesses, which I think is a very good thing. They're not having to hear the investigator's interpretation of what the witness saw, because, you know, what you see is what you see, and the way you describe it is, there is a bit of interpretation that happens, the language that you choose to use, the sort of framework that you put it in to reconcile it. And then as an investigator, you know, we're interpreting that, and then we offer our interpretation of it. And so it's a couple of stages removed. So I think it's great through podcasts that people can hear directly from claimants who describe their encounters. And when you listen to enough of those people and you hear directly from liars and yarn spinners, you start to be able to differentiate those things pretty easily, because a certain sort of claim stacks up, a certain sort of description, phenomenological elements, observational elements, etc., versus the wild outliers. You're like, oh, okay, I just listened to 100 witnesses on 100 podcasts, and this one sounds like I can dismiss it. And so it gives every listener that ability to do it. So there's cost benefit there, but I do think that's a big benefit. I mean, I produce a Sasquatch related podcast, but I spend a lot of time listening to podcasts of all sorts, not just in the Sasquatch related one, but anonymity has its costs and benefits too, because there are some people who would only tell their story publicly if they knew that no one would ever figure out their identity, right? And so those people have an outlet through certain podcasts or other online venues, so, but it's, as you know, it's a wild world online, and like, I'd rather be in the woods with the snakes and the bears sometimes than on social media. That's for sure.
Oh, absolutely. One thing I realized when we got together the other night to do a little squatching is that, you know what? We didn't see any Bigfoots, Sasquatches. We didn't see any UFOs. But what we did do was we did get together and fellowship together as people. And we found that personal connection with each other as humans. So we found humans. And ever since COVID, I've realized that we should never take that for granted, the opportunity to get out and connect with each other, right? So I would love to follow up on something you said there with two things. One, in this modern era, what do you think is greater, the potential for good in Sasquatch research in the modern era, or the potential for bad with what you dub exploiters in your book? And then two, you mentioned the Bigfoot and Beyond podcast, which you produce with Cliff and Bobo from Finding Bigfoot. Can you tell us a little bit about that and where people can find it?
Oh, certainly. So for your first question, I mean, every human endeavor is, going to be infected to some degree by people who are out to exploit others. And so skeptics will use that and go, oh, look at the Bigfoot thing. There's some of these people are hoaxing, and some of these people are hoaxing for money. And, some of these people are deceiving people so intently that, it's basically extortion in some cases, on and on and on. It's like, yeah, but that doesn't mean that the whole endeavor is not worthwhile, because otherwise, let's throw out the legal system and the justice system and the medical system and the pharmaceutical system and the government. I mean, there are bad actors in every human endeavor, and it's very unfortunate. And I wish there weren't any. But part of pointing that out in the book is sort of like, here's the commonalities between some of these exploiters that I've seen over the years, and maybe that will help other people recognize it. Because I do think that they sort of blur the what little data we do have, trying to piece it together into this coherent model of like, what is the Sasquatch? And then basically the exploiters and the hoaxers are just like defacing it. They're vandalism, graffiti, planting their own flags. And then people can't tell, like, well, what's the thing we're looking for? What's the noise and what's the signal anymore? And newcomers think it's all signal. They can't really differentiate between that yet. But again, it's no reason to give up on aiming for the good, and it's no reason that, cynical people, like I said, will go, oh, it's all hogwash. It's all hoaxers and liars. It's like, no, it's not. It's just not. Any more than, like I said, you find a corrupt or a bad actor in any other human endeavor, you wouldn't throw out the whole endeavor just because of a few bad actors. So I do hope that, people, I try to be very optimistic about the future of the subject. I just would love to have a conclusive answer to that fundamental question, not only for myself, but obviously it would be great to have one for the satisfaction of everyone involved in this pursuit, whether it ends up being something that's not the biological hypothesis that I offer. Like, I'd love to be wrong about that, but I do think that that's the most likely answer.
Well, can I interrupt real quick on that?
Certainly.
Matt, do you want to find the answer, or do you think that the mystery itself is better?
No, I think the answer would be better. I definitely do. I mean, there would be unintended consequences, because there always are.
Right.
And I talk about this at the end of the book, is that, everyone who's engaged in any sort of endeavor, like, there is a bit of a moral aim, and it's sort of nested within like an imaginative vision of the future. And so I think for proponents, it is sort of, well, if these animals are real, understanding them will benefit us, and maybe it'll benefit them. And maybe we can protect more of their habitat, and we can learn about ourselves and our evolution and our close relatives, etc. And we can, again, protect lands that they might need or stop certain areas from being cut. But there could be unintended consequences too, whereas like discovery has a negative impact. You just don't know, but you have a certain vision. And I think for the skeptics too, it's like their vision, or not just skeptics, but cynics, let's say, people who are out to debunk everything, there's no shortage of those people in the UFO world too. I think that they have the same utopian vision, is that the world will be a better place if we can eliminate the lies, and if we can knock down the pseudoscience, and we can peel the blindfolds off people and show them the truth, which is that UFOs don't exist, or Sasquatches don't exist, whatever, fill in the blank. They are still sort of like moral agents on their own quest to bring about a vision of a greater good. They don't see themselves as the villains, certainly, but that has unintended. Sometimes they debunk the wrong people. Sometimes they defame or discredit perfectly good people. And so, you just don't know what's going to happen. I mean, there's this idea, the whole scientific endeavor is like, maybe an investigation of the material world will bring about advances that'll make human life flourish, progress. Or maybe it'll end a nuclear war. We'll see.
Oh,
you know what I mean? I mean, it's like either we just don't know. But I'm very optimistic, or else I wouldn't have been doing this for as long as I have. And so I know I do think it's worth figuring out the answer. I think it'll vindicate a lot of people, witnesses who've been ridiculed, academics or scientists who've put their reputations on the line just to look into the question. And man, don't you want to see, like, if they exist, don't you want to see like the 4-hour Netflix or Nat Geo special documentary with all the cool,
Yeah.
Heck yeah. And I think it's safe to assume you could be involved in that project.
I think so.
I don't know. I've never seen one, so I'm not very good at this. I've been trying for a long time. So
has there been any evidence of Bigfoot, we're talking about modern times, on satellite imagery or any sort of caught on a drone or something to that effect?
No, you have to think that the analogy I always use with people is like, pull up North Georgia on Google Maps right now, or Google Earth. You see this aerial photos, the satellite view, etc. And if we just look at Northeast Georgia, or the portion of North Georgia that's the Chattahoochee National Forest, the estimates are that there's roughly 5,000 black bears in there. I will give you $100 for every bear that you can find me in those images. And you won't, because there's a canopy, and,
Right.
and even in the wintertime when the deciduous leaves fall, there's still thickets of pine or, other rhododendron, mountain laurel, holly, other things that are evergreen. And so I don't think satellites will ever produce an image unless one were to walk out into some open area at exactly the right moment in time where it could be differentiated from a human or some other sort of animal. So, but again, any image you look at of Southern Appalachia, there are thousands of black bears in that image at any given point in time. Find one, And
That's
so
true.
if Sasquatches exist, they're in those images too. They're just under that canopy.
I wanted
That's
to
a great point.
tell Matt the story. My uncle, when he was, of course, he's in his 70s, but when he was a little kid, there was a man in North Mississippi said that, and he was an old gentleman at the time, so he was back during wagon times, because around here in the late or early 1900s, people still use wagons. And so he said that they went to a revival one night and they snuck out to go smoke a cigarette. They were sitting in the back of a wagon. So all of a sudden, a Sasquatch came out of the woods, couldn't see him, and went to the front of the porch. Of course, here there was no air conditioner or anything at that time, anyhow, period, anywhere pretty much. And said the back doors were open, or the front doors, and said he placed his hands on the porch and sat and watched the congregation for a few minutes, and then just stood up and just walked off into the darkness. He said that the man said he was so scared he didn't know what to do. He just stayed in the wagon and tried not to move.
Yeah, people have reported seeing them look in windows. And, it reminds me of an anthropology, a professor at a community college in the Atlanta area that I communicated with about the subject. He did research on the Cheyenne Reservation when he was writing his doctoral thesis, and had this event occur that he went with one of the I guess the tribal, I don't know if they were tribal law enforcement or not, but anyway, it was at a prayer house, and there was snow on the ground, and there were these huge man-like tracks, very large Sasquatch tracks apparently, or ostensibly. And the previous night, these I guess it's sort of like a youth group were in this prayer house meeting and convening, and said they saw this Sasquatch come and stare in the window at them for a while. And this professor had said, because we were discussing the subject, and he said, he was so flabbergasted, like, here's the Sasquatch story, and there's these tracks in the snow. And he said the older Cheyenne gentleman he was with said to the young people, "It's like, would you put food out for him?" And they were like, "Huh?" And he said, "You kids, you don't know anything. He was probably hungry, and you made him stand there. You're supposed to put out food for him." It was just very dismissive, that they should have already known what to do in this situation. And so he had said, the professor, he was like, "I don't know if they're real or not." He said, "But those tracks were real. And what those young people reported, probably in their teens or early 20s, what they reported seemed authentic." And he said, this older guy knew all, like, it didn't even faze him to hear that a Sasquatch walked up and looked in the window at night watching these people inside. So there's a lot of stories, similar descriptions of behavior.
That's a great story, and that brings up an aspect of squatching. I'm using a term directly from Finding Bigfoot here, that perhaps evolved in the modern era, and that is gifting. It sounds like he's referring to, I think, certainly feeding Sasquatch. And by the way, this is not the first we've heard of feeding Sasquatch. Arthur Becky Cook from Bigfoot in Idaho, that series, she's brought this notion up quite a bit. Matt, do you think there's something to this notion of gifting, or even on a more basic level, feeding wild animals? Certainly that might come into play.
Oh, certainly. I mean, there's a number of stories where people claim to have, had food stolen, or to have left food intentionally for Sasquatches over a period of time, and occasionally had sightings that way. And so, I mean, you would expect the same behavior from other large omnivorous mammals. Bears will exploit human food resources very often. And so I don't see why these things wouldn't, again, if they do exist. And, we've all tried it as researchers in various ways and shapes and forms. But yeah, some of those stories are very compelling, very often at people's properties or at their homes. And some of the more aggressive reports I'm aware of involve food, where there seemed to be some food source that the thing was exploiting, unbeknownst to the person. The person just knows that, like, hey, this stuff's gone every time I put it out. And they finally get frustrated. And, oh, my neighbor's stealing my feed bags, or, some bear's coming in at night and stealing these feed bags, or whatever the food may be. And they stop putting it out. And that's usually, the banging on the house, or throwing rocks at the house, or these sort of escalations of aggressive behavior. And I've heard that time and time and time again, all over the country, which is really interesting. And usually these are claimants who, they don't know much about the subject. They were reaching out and like, hey, I'm having strange things. Sometimes they'll catch a glimpse, or they'll see it. And they'll usually people have on these repeated visitation cases, they have strange things happening that they're just hearing, because a lot of it's at night. Now, most people in their decision tree of what could be making these sounds, the Sasquatch is not on there. So they're like, is that a person? Is that a bear? What's going on out here? So like we said, some people it's a ghost. And then eventually they'll see it. They catch a glimpse of it, and then they'll realize that is what's been doing these other things for the last however many weeks or months. And so, I've heard these reports from people, and they'll, something slapping my house, or throwing rocks at the house, or whatever the case may be. And I'll be like, well, do you have food outside? No, nothing like that. Like, okay, what about compost pile or trash, or do you have dogs? And one gentleman in particular was in Arkansas, and it said, no, nothing like that. And, we don't have outdoor dogs. And so later in the conversation, he had said something about the little barn. And I was like, well, what's in the barn? And he's like, oh, we got a couple like little ponies down there. Like, okay, well, what do you feed them? And he's like, oh, well, I used to have these big bags of sweet feed. big 75-pound bags of sweet feed. But my neighbor kept breaking in the barn and stealing them. And he's like, I don't know why you'd steal them. They're cheap. It only costs so much. So he's like, I don't even store them in the barn anymore. I'm like, where do you store them? He's like, oh, in the house. And I was like, so when did the banging start? And he was like, about the time I started putting the sweet feed in the house. And I was like, there you go. Those things were coming down there and they found this free food source, if that's what it was, if it was Sasquatches. And then they'd probably seen him, truck coming in and unloading these bags. And instead of dumping them in the barn, because you imagine, if you're a wild animal in North America, the richest source of sugar you're going to get is honey. And you're not going to get much of it. And it's not going to be that fun or easy to get, honey from beehives.
It's going to come at a price.
So you find a 75-pound bag of sweet feed, it's just like starch rich and sugar rich and carbohydrate rich, I'm sure. And that's a big payoff, and so those sorts of things, I've heard those kinds of encounters many, many times. So a lot of people, that's why you'll hear a lot of people say like, oh, don't start trying to feed the things at your house unless you plan on just doing it perpetually, because if you stop. So I don't know. I've never experienced that directly, but I've heard from many, many claimants along those lines.
And it makes a lot of sense if you think about it, of course. And I mentioned the term squatching. We're so honored tonight, by the way, to have Matt Pruitt with us, author of The Phenomenal Sasquatch. You can pick it up at bigfootufo.com. We got folks tuning in on YouTube, on Twitter, or X, on Facebook. You can find all those for us on bigfootufo.com as well. And Matt, I feel like squatching, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I honestly think it entered the common vernacular during the Finding Bigfoot show. And we all loved Finding Bigfoot. My favorite part of Finding Bigfoot with Matt Moneymaker and Cliff and Bobo, and what really set it apart were the town hall events, right? Where they brought everybody together and heard all these different stories from all these different people in a polite, respectful setting, right? And I just thought that really set it apart. And now you are the producer of the Bigfoot and Beyond podcast with Cliff and Bobo. What can you tell us about Bigfoot and Beyond and working with Cliff and Bobo?
Oh, certainly. Well, I think for credit where credit's due, I think the first time squatching was really out there was a filmmaker named Scott Harriet, a researcher and filmmaker, made a little documentary called that. And I think, but Bobo popularized it. And so certainly it got into the world consciousness because of Finding Bigfoot. But even Bobo uses like, oh, Scott made up that term. Everyone credits Bobo with it though. But I'd actually known all those people prior to the series. So I met Matt Moneymaker in 2007 and was going out in the field with him, and then joined the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. And then I moved to Washington from Georgia. I actually met Renee in 2008. And she was on a couple of field expeditions that I was on. And it's been a little time with her there. But then when the show was being developed, she was one of the people that sort of got the call to be the non-believer, let's say. She kind of plays the role of the skeptic, so to speak.
The Scully.
They didn't want a whole, exactly. That would be
the CJ.
A good reference there. And then I met Cliff and Bobo both in 2009. Now I'd known about Bobo for years because, he's a pretty legendary character in Sasquatchery and definitely has lived up to it. And so I was spending a lot of time with Cliff when I lived out there. And then the show got picked up. When we really bonded is Bob Saget, the late, great Bob Saget, had a series that was very short-lived called Strange Days on A&E. And he filmed an episode going out in the field in the Olympic Peninsula of Washington. It was like Moneymaker and Cliff and Bobo and Bart Catino and me, and a bunch of us were present on that shoot, and you can see us in the episode. But he and Bobo, Saget and Bobo, really hit it off. So Bobo's like the star of that episode. But me and Cliff really bonded there, and then started being out in the field together a lot. And so when the show finally got greenlit, they went and shot a pilot in Alaska, and they decided to pick up a whole season, 6 episodes. And I had sort of had this info pack for North Georgia because Moneymaker in the BFR was like, hey, people, send me what you have together so we can pitch some places. So I was like, here's everything I have with witnesses who are willing to go on camera and pieces of visual evidence that you can look at. And it was one of the first to get greenlit. It was the second one to be filmed on that run. And then it became the premiere episode of the whole series. So that was great fun. And Cliff and Moneymaker, especially, and Bobo, the production company's putting that together. And Matt and Cliff, especially, were like, hey, you should just hire Matt Pruitt because he's done all the research. He knows everyone. It's his hometown. He's got all the connections. Just hire him. And they did, which was kind of amazing because I had no experience in production, obviously. I played music professionally, so music production, but not television production. And so that went really well. It turned out to be a great episode. And then when the next season started to be filmed, they asked me to do the same thing for Oklahoma. So I did that same job for an episode on season 3 called CSI Bigfoot that we filmed in central Oklahoma. And so, Cliff is like a brother to me, and Bobo and I had a lot of fun. And so when the show ended, the discussion was like, oh, let's keep it, they were talking about let's keep the conversation going with our audience. And they knew that I did a lot of recording and engineering and editing, and said, well, hey, if we did a podcast, like, would you want to do it? And I just wanted it to be easy for them. Like, hey, you guys just talk, I'll do everything else. So we don't record live. It's not like red light fever. I mean, it's really wild, free flowing conversations and mess ups and goof ups and like, hey, what year did that happen again? Okay. So, in 1968, the thing was, blah, 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 so it's my role is to like let them do all that. And then I'll make the episode out of it so that they don't have to worry about, they can stop and check references, or if they say a line that let me say that again, I can say that better, So that's sort of my role as producer editor. So they're sort of curated and we record individual tracks, and I can mix, EQ, compress those individually and all that. And so I just wanted it to be the sort of thing where all they had to do was talk and not worry about any of the technical stuff, or like, I'll handle everything else. So it's been a lot of fun. We're 4 years in now. I think next week's episode is 232. And then we do a bonus show that we have like 55 episodes of that now that comes out. The main show comes out every Monday and the bonus show comes out every Thursday. So we've been doing 2 a week now. So done it many times at this point.
That's a lot of extra work.
It is, but it makes them like from playing music. The best producers were the ones that like just let you create and be you, and they handled all the technical stuff. If you had an idea, it wasn't like, okay, well, you need to tweak knobs for 30 minutes before we start to work on your idea. It's like, no, you just be you and I'll handle everything else. It's the same with like management too. I was in a major label band that had couple of rough years, and it's like, no, a good manager makes sure that all you ever have to do is the thing you love, and they handle everything else. And that's, again, the way I always wanted it to be for them. It's like, you guys just talk, have the conversations, like say whatever you want. You go, oh, take that out, Pruitt. I don't want, we can't let that go on the air. And it's like, okay, I'll handle all that afterwards. So it's a lot of fun.
It does make a big difference. I tell you what, it makes such a big difference. Even the distraction of one small technical situation can completely and utterly throw you off of everything. So not having to deal with that, it sure must be a real benefit for Cliff and Bobo. And CJ and Smitty, do y'all have anything before we switch over to a few hot takes for Matt?
No,
let's dive into those hot takes.
Sounds
okay.
good.
Well, we really appreciate your time tonight, Matt. We're talking to Matt Pruitt, author of the Phenomenal Sasquatch and producer of the Bigfoot and Beyond podcast with Cliff and Bobo. And I've got just a few things that we would love to get your hot take on. We like to do this with a lot of our guests on the show. And first, I'm just going to play a little clip. I think you may have seen this footage before. I don't think it's going to be new to you. And we would love your hot take on this. The infamous Patty, the Patterson-Gimlin film. And that's just my little clip there. 8 seconds of it.
Well, it's iconic, obviously iconic enough that, that's the image everyone associates with with the subject. My hot take, I guess that's when you're supposed to provide like a controversial take, right?
No, not
in
contra-
today's
It doesn't
Yeah,
have to be.
just a
My
quick.
hot take would be that it's been spoken of and written of to death. It's one of those things that I'm like, man, if I never spoke about it again, it would be. But to be honest, to be fair, I mean, it's clearly mystifying and fascinating because obviously it's not been thoroughly debunked or conclusively debunked in all this time. And in fact, as technology improves, it's an observation that many people have made. They said it in the 80s, they said it in the 90s, they said it in the early 2000s. Oh, as technology improves, we can see more detail. It stands up. And that seems to be true even now in 2023. But, the main point against it is the lack of other evidence. That's the frustrating thing. And I don't mean evidence of the event, because obviously you have Gimlin's testimony, Patterson's testimony, the interviews they gave in the aftermath, the left and right tracks that they cast. Days later, Lyle Laverty, Forest Service timber cruiser, comes by, photographs multiple tracks at the site. Days after that, Bob Titmus comes and casts 10 consecutive tracks. So there's a lot of evidence, or both anecdotal and physical, associated with that event. But I think what it implies that people struggle with is that, like, well, if that film is of a living animal, then there have to be a species of these things. It can't be just like some one-off anomaly, because it seems to jive with what people describe in Southern Appalachia and the interior highlands and the Ozarks, or the Ozarks are part of the interior highlands, the Adirondacks, the Intermountain West and the Rockies, the Pacific Northwest, on and on and on. People describe things that look like that. And so very often the debates about the film that I hear of, like, well, if that's real, then why has no one shot one or found a body yet? Which doesn't really deal with the film. That's one of the, and we definitely, that question needs to be answered. I try to lay out why I think it's possible that that's not occurred yet in the book. But that is one of the frustrating things, is that you can show people evidence, A, B, C, D, A through E, and they'll go, yeah, but where's F? And you're like, hey, can we deal with these first before we worry about the thing that's missing? And I can't tell you how many, I put an anecdote in the book of a family friend of mine who wanted to see sort of, there's a presentation that I would give to it was like continuing education. It was actually accredited by North Carolina there, which was pretty funny because I don't even have a degree, but to get college credit hours for this, of course, I would give it the Park Ranger Institute. That was an overview of the subjects. And it's like a 3-hour long lecture or presentation, multimedia. And I presented all this to this family friend, and we went over it for a long time. And then at the end, he said, I don't know, man. Don't you think someone would have found something by now? And I was like, oh, do you mean like the tracks and the hair and the vocalizations and everything that we just talked about for 3 hours? And he's like, oh, but besides all that stuff. So that's again, the main argument you hear about the film that people make. It's like, oh, well, if they were real, we would have found one by now. Ergo, they don't exist. Ergo, that has to be a man in a suit. And, there have been claims from people who claim to be the person in the suit, and some of that I address in the book. And, it's an open question. If the film is legitimate, I think there's a perfectly normal environmental reason that you would have that opportunity in that. And I know we're probably going way over time, so if you need to shut me up, just let me know. But
No, this is great.
That's a tight, narrow drainage, Bluff Creek. It's in steep country. And in 3 years prior, in 1964, there was a massive flood that affected all the tributaries of the Klamath. And so, man, when you drive through there, like some of those roads, you're driving along the mountainside and the Klamath River's way down below you. And up on the stone wall next to the road, there's these flood markers that are so insanely high that show you the flood of 64. And so that canyon, if I understand it right, if I remember correctly, huge blizzard, like snowfall accumulated, and then it heated up very quickly. So all that snowfall melted and caused this flooding. And in that steep, tight, narrow canyon, all that raging floodwater basically denuded everything in the bottom of it. That's why you see in that footage big open sort of destruction, big giant sandbar. I've been there in 2010. It's like a jungle now. If you look up, and many people go there, look up videos, it looks like a thick jungly sort of forest, which is the way it should have looked. But in essence, any animal that lived in that drainage after that flood, if it wanted to access water to drink, it had to leave the security of the tree line to approach the waterway. And it was a pretty remote spot. I mean, obviously they were doing some logging back there, so there were roads. But even still, when people are, oh, why would it be out in the open like that? Well, every animal in Bluff Creek that wanted to access that water source had to leave the security of the tree line, stride out across that denuded area in order to get water. And so you have luck, if it's real, luck of Patterson and Gimlin, right place, right time. They claim it was squatted down when they first saw it. So we would presume its ears are close to the rushing water. So maybe it didn't hear the approach of the horses. Maybe it was drinking, who knows, or just staring at its own reflection like Frankenstein or something like that, who knows. But and you just happen to have this environmental context that it had flooded. And so otherwise, they'd seem to stay in, reports come from very densely forested areas, and occasionally they'll cross a road following a waterway or something like that. But it has been beaten to death. There's great books about it. I would suggest reading all of them, the skeptical and the proponent books. Bill Munn's When Roger Met Patty is a fascinating read. Greg Long's The Making of Bigfoot is a fascinating read. And it's still worthy of further scrutiny.
Absolutely. And another hot take for you, speaking of heavily forested areas that have been denuded, but not at this time. And I'm actually wearing a shirt from this area, Mount St. Helens. In 1924, in Ape Canyon on Mount St. Helens, some miners apparently had a violent encounter with some Sasquatches who were hurling rocks and other things at their cabin on a cliff inside the canyon, apparently trying to run them off. What's your hot take on the 1924 Ape Canyon incident?
I think it's very important historically because it actually did make the Associated Press. It spread. Most of those other print media articles I talked about stayed local. They might have gotten picked up by another paper here or there regionally, but that story really went far and wide. What they called the apes. I fought the apes of, then there was the great the great ape hunt, not hump, the great ape hunt of 24, which after the publication of that article and it's spreading on the AP wire, all sorts of folks started coming there with guns, trying to bag one of these things. And the Forest Service basically had to shut it down because they thought people were just going to be shooting at each other. So it was the first Sasquatch related story to get national attention. And it predated the word Sasquatch. So they just called them mountain devils or apes. And then interestingly, there was an article written by a guy named George Totsky. And he wrote for, I believe the publication was called The Real American, but he was an indigenous person. And he sort of makes the first connection in print media to say, what these guys are calling apes or mountain devils, we've called this for so long. And let me just make sure I'm using the correct nomenclature, because there's obviously so many indigenous words that are alike, like Siatic and Skookum and Siatic and Siatko. So I'm trying to remember exactly which one he references there. Siatic. So yeah, it was he wrote for a magazine, and he was the editor of The Real American, which was a publication for indigenous people. But he did write an article released by the Oregonian in the aftermath, where he basically makes that first connection in print media between what the non-natives, people like the settlers were calling apes or mountain devils, and what the indigenous people called Siatics, and saying these are the same thing. We've known about these things for a long time. And he describes them. They're very big, hair covered, etc. So that Ape Canyon encounter is very important historically for those reasons.
Well, and I would be remiss if I didn't follow up on that, Matt. And I just feel like I have to do this. But obviously, if there was a population of apes in the Mount St. Helens area, then clearly the Mount St. Helens eruption would have had some sort of significant ecological impact on that population, as it did every animal population, including Homo sapiens in the area. And, there are theories out there that the military coordinated an effort to potentially remove Sasquatch bodies. So, what do you think about these theories?
The source of that story comes from a single individual who claimed that his father told him that he witnessed that occur. And this individual was associated with Ray Crow and the Western Bigfoot Society in Oregon. And so he first published it, I think, as an anonymous letter. He had a publication, a little newsletter he called The Track Record. And that's where that story originated from. And then I think it was, could be wrong, but this book, Who's Watching You by Linda Kovalsucci, she points out that the individual was Fred Bradshaw, who was sort of a known, what's the right word here? I guess maybe yarn spinner or troublemaker. I guess fairly harmless guy, but spinner of tall tales by reputation. I never met Fred, so I don't know from personal experience. But so essentially that all stems from that one single source of like, oh, well, my dad said he saw such and such occur. And it's gotten mythologized in the internet era where people go, oh, lots of people said they saw these helicopters carrying body bags with hairy arms and legs hanging out of them, which are just all permutations of this one story that Ray Crow put in the track record years ago. And so there's no there's no people alive today that made those claims, or even really back then. It's just one of those things that gets mythologized and repeated and retold. Like there's other examples of that. The Loch Ness surgeon's photo that was basically a deathbed confession, that has been so heavily conflated with Patterson that I cannot tell you how many people I've met that are like, oh yeah, Patterson confessed on his deathbed that he faked that footage. It's like, no, he didn't. There's no record of that anywhere whatsoever. It's people conflating these two events, and it gets mythologized and repeated that way. And I think the St. Helens story is the same deal. Whereas you have an animal that's got ostensibly a very large home range based on, there's a number of reasons that we think that would be the case, but even putting Sasquatch aside, let's say mountain lions. How many mountain lions frequent the St. Helens area at any given time? They have big home ranges and they need a lot of space, and they're fairly, solitary animals. And so even Helens blowing and affecting a certain area, how many mountain lions did it take out? Maybe one or two, who knows, maybe more, but it's a very small number. So you look at like the trophic pyramid, the distribution of the energy of the sun essentially through the natural world via food. You've got all your small rodents and things at the bottom. As you get to those apex predators, there's very few. They're very rare animals. They're small in number. And so it's certainly possible that the explosion of that volcano, the eruption, would have had an effect, but I don't think there would have been like bodies being flown in and out of there. But since we can go back to like, here's the first time that was ever said anywhere and who said it, because it wasn't during the time, it was like in the 90s when Fred Bradshaw apparently made this claim. It wasn't in the actual eruption. So I think we could chalk that one up as like a tall tale,
Oh, good point. And my last hot take for you, Matt, and we're so thankful to have Matt Pruitt here with us tonight, author of The Phenomenal Sasquatch. Pick it up at BigfootUFO.com. Matt, on our podcast, we have seen a definite correlation between Sasquatch encounters and UFO alien encounters. Okay, so what I'd like to know, what is your gut
reaction? This doesn't feel like a hot take.
It's a little bit of a buildup. What's your gut reaction here? Well, one, is there a statistical correlation that you have noticed between Sasquatches and UFO activity, but also the keystone event of all of ufology? What's your gut instinct about what happened in 1947 in Roswell, New Mexico?
Well, in terms of the Sasquatch UFO thing, like I'm not a student of the UFO subject, but I find it fascinating. And so, I've read some books and I've listened to, Micah Hanks is a good friend of mine and he's very connected in that world. So I've learned a lot from listening to his podcast and speaking with him. But, the UFO, let's say, is a worldwide phenomenon. Like people claim to see these things all over the planet. The Sasquatch is not. So there's a very big difference there. Now, mystery apes do occur in other parts of the world. There's essentially In North America, you have the Sasquatch. You go into Siberia down through China, have Sasquatch-like creatures, roughly the same height, width, that extend down through like the Malaysian Peninsula down into essentially Australia, with the Yowie. And then as you go further westward, you have these more man-like forms like the Almasti, which are very markedly different than what people report for the Sasquatch. And then in the islands, you have the diminutive hominids, Orang Pendek, Ibu Gogo, etc. You do not find mystery apes in the Carpathians, Scandinavia, Bavaria, the Alps, on and on and on. Fiji, Korea, plenty of like forested mountain habitats where, again, if it was the product of the human mind, why aren't they being seen there? If they're associated with UFOs, why aren't they seen everywhere that UFOs are seen? There's no Sasquatch reports from Hawaii. Again, you could pull many of these places out of a hat around the world. And so, of course, if you have a global phenomenon like the UFO and a localized phenomenon or a continental phenomenon like the Sasquatch, of course, they'll co-occur in places. But I would also say, if a Sasquatch was seen in North Georgia and UFOs are seen in North Georgia, why would I think that the two would be connected? Why wouldn't I think that, there's a lot of deer in North Georgia. Are deer associated with UFOs or possums or raccoons or bears or, the list goes on, bird
Cattle.
species, whatever the case may be. So to me, it's like the fact that they co-occur geographically, I don't think is enough to say that they're connected or correlated to that degree. Then, otherwise, if they were seen all over the world, again, I'd be like, yeah, there's some sort of psychocultural phenomenon happening. To me, it's fascinating that you can go to the Carpathians where there are elk and there are brown bears and there are wolves, a lot of the same things you find in North America, and there's no history of mystery ape reports. There's no collection of evidence. There's no modern day reports of these things. And so which you would expect, if it's totally imaginary, it should just happen everywhere that there's. First of all, it should happen everywhere, but people don't report them at the gym or in the hospital or in the kitchen. They report them in forested mountains mostly. Okay, well, let's go to other forested mountains in the world. Why aren't they reported in those places? So to me, it's indicative that there are biological animals. Now, whatever UFOs are, if they are interested in the planet's fauna, which some, I guess, reports or analyses suggest, maybe they're interested in those things too. And I have to say, of all of the UFO related claims, the ones that really fascinate me are the crash retrieval claims. Because, I wish we had, it's the same in the Sasquatch world. It's like some people claim to have shot and killed Sasquatches or hit them with a vehicle and killed them. And then for whatever reason, abandoned it, yada, yada, yada. They're claims, right? But it's like, man, that could be the key that unlocks this whole thing if any of those claims are true. And so certainly UFO claims have the same sort of potential. And so I didn't know much about the subject. And at the behest of a friend, I read Witness to Roswell, and it was pretty compelling. So it seems like something happened there that was beyond just the errant weather balloon. According to, because that book was so meticulously documented, there were so many claimants where it's like, okay, something beyond the official sort of weather balloon story occurred. And I'd love to know what that was. I hope we all get to find out someday. But that book I found really fascinating.
We all hope we get to find out someday too. Well,
Certainly.
Matt, it has been so educational to have you. I'm just impressed with how much you know about all things Sasquatch, and your vocabulary is quite impressive too. So you can put that on your resume.
Very generous of you.
Is there anything else that you wanted to share before we wrap up this show?
No, I just thank you guys so much for having me on. I know we went over the hour time frame.
Not a problem.
Brevity has often eluded me, maybe more than the Sasquatch has. So I apologize for rambling so much.
No, it was wonderful.
It was a good,
absolutely
good
wonderful.
show. Good show.
Yes. Okay. So once again, this was Matt Pruitt with the Phenomenal Sasquatch. You can find his book on our website currently, which is bigfootufo.com. If you are listening to us on YouTube, we hope that you will subscribe and like. And thank you for tuning in and for your questions. I'm going to send it to Smitty for our sign off.
Remember, to be happy, be strange, listen to All Things Unexplained, and look for Sasquatch. Good night.
Good night, everybody. Thanks. Like, share, follow, comment, subscribe, support. What's your hot take on Travis Taylor?
I've got an exclusive for you guys if you want it about the
Yes,
Alaska.
we do.
Okay.
All Things Unexplained.
So some of that I think, sir, we'll save for closed session.